Cold was the only truth she had ever known. It was a creature that lived in the marrow of her bones, a constant companion in the miserable half-life she endured. It seeped up from the flagstones of the great hall, through the threadbare knees of her trousers, and into her skin. The lye soap in her bucket was a slush of ice and caustic chemicals, and it bit at the raw cracks in her fingers, 1,000 tiny mouths chewing on her flesh. Alara gritted her teeth, the motion a small, sharp sound in the cavernous silence. She hunched her shoulders and scrubbed harder, her reflection a warped and wavering ghost in the wet stone. This was her purpose. This was her worth. A pair of chapped hands, a strong back, and the ability to make herself so small, so utterly invisible, that the others might forget to strike her. They called her Omega, a title that was less a rank and more a curse, a brand of worthlessness seared onto her soul at birth. An orphan left on the Silver Moon Pack's doorstep, she had never known a mother's touch or a father's pride. She had only known the backs of hands, the sting of cruel words, and the gnawing emptiness of a stomach that was never, ever full. Her world was this floor, this endless, cold, unforgiving floor. A shadow fell over her. Alara flinched, curling into herself by instinct, her head ducking low, a reflex honed by years of pain. "Still at it, little mouse?" The voice was sweet as honey laced with poison. Lyra. Alara did not look up. To meet the eyes of the Alpha's daughter was to invite a storm. She kept her gaze fixed on the gray swirls of dirt in her water bucket. "Alpha Lyra," she murmured, her voice a dry rasp. A delicate leather-clad boot tapped impatiently beside her hand. "My father is holding council. This floor is a disgrace, just like everything else you touch." Alara's fingers tightened on her rag. Disgrace, mouse, filth. The words were stones, and she was buried under their weight. She scrubbed with a frantic energy, desperate to make the shadow go away. "Oh dear," Lyra cooed, a theatrical gasp in her voice. A sudden, searing heat splashed across Alara's back. She cried out, a strangled yelp of pure agony as the hot, spiced cider soaked through her thin tunic and scalded her skin. It felt like being flayed alive. "Clumsy me," Lyra said, her voice devoid of any real apology. "You should watch where you grovel, Omega. You're a hazard." Tears pricked at Alara's eyes, hot and shameful. The pain was a living fire, spreading across her shoulder blades, but she would not give Lyra the satisfaction of seeing her break. She bit down hard on her lower lip, tasting the coppery tang of blood. She held the scream in her throat until it felt like a shard of glass. "Clean up your mess," Lyra commanded, her tone sharp as a winter wind. She turned and walked away, the sound of her laughter echoing off the high, cold ceilings of the hall. Alara stayed hunched over for a long moment, trembling. The cold of the floor was a strange mercy now, leaching some of the fire from her back. Slowly, painfully, she dipped her rag into the icy water and began to clean up the sticky, sweet-smelling spill. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her, but she did not stop. She would not break. It was the only thing they could not take from her. This tiny, stubborn core of resilience buried so deep they would never find it. She would endure this, just as she had endured everything else. She would finish the floor. She would retreat to her cold attic cot. She would survive. What other choice did she have? Later, in the sliver of a room she called her own, she shivered under a blanket that was little more than a collection of holes. The burn on her back was a throbbing map of misery. sleep would not come. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful, rising shriek that promised a storm. Alara listened to it, a strange kinship with its wild, untamed sorrow. The wind did not care if you were Alpha or Omega. It treated everyone with the same brutal indifference. She pressed her face into her lumpy pillow, the scent of straw and dust filling her nose, and wished, not for the first time, that she could be like the wind, free and formless, and powerful enough to tear the whole world down. The wish was a flicker of heat in the vast coldness of her existence, a tiny, impossible dream. It was a dangerous thing, a hope, and hope was a luxury an Omega could not afford. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the thought away, and prayed for the oblivion of a dreamless sleep that never came. The blizzard arrived like a god's wrath. It descended upon the Silver Moon territory overnight, a churning, blinding wall of white that swallowed the world. The wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the very foundations of the longhouse. Snow piled in drifts higher than a man's head, burying everything in a cold, silent tomb. By the second day, the whispers started. A cough in the children's dormitory, a fever in the warriors' barracks. The healer, an old woman named Elspeth, wore a permanent frown, her brow furrowed with worry. "The frost fern is gone," Alara heard her tell the Alpha, her voice thin and strained. "The lung fever will take hold without it. I need more. From the Whisperwind Ridge." A heavy silence fell over the Alpha's council. The Whisperwind Ridge was treacherous on the best of days, a narrow spine of rock known for its sudden winds and unstable footing. In a blizzard like this, it was a suicide mission. Alara was refilling the wood bins by the hearth, trying to remain invisible, when Lyra's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Send the Omega." Every head turned. Alara froze, her arms full of splintery logs. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, and the weight of them was a physical blow. "She is worthless, Father," Lyra continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "But she is strong of back and has nothing better to do. Let her prove she deserves the scraps we feed her. Let her fetch the frost fern." It was a death sentence, and everyone in that room knew it. A way to be rid of the pack's unwanted ghost without having to dirty their own hands. Alara looked at the Alpha, a flicker of desperate pleading in her eyes. He was her leader, sworn to protect every member of his pack. His gaze was cold as the stone floor. He looked at her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. "It is decided," he said, his voice a final, booming judgment. "Alara will go, for the good of the pack." For the good of the pack. The words were a bitter acid in her throat. They gave her a worn cloak, a small sack, and a piece of stale bread. No one met her eyes as she walked to the great doors. No one wished her well. She was already a ghost to them. The moment she stepped outside, the storm hit her like a physical fist. The wind tore the breath from her lungs and filled her mouth with ice. The snow was a disorienting, suffocating whirlwind. She could see nothing, feel nothing but the all-consuming cold. For a moment, she considered just lying down, letting the snow cover her. It would be so easy. A quick, cold sleep, an end to the pain. But then the image of Lyra's triumphant smirk flashed in her mind, the Alpha's dismissive glare, the years of being nothing, and that stubborn, stupid core of resilience inside her ignited. No, she would not give them the satisfaction. She pulled the thin cloak tighter, lowered her head against the gale, and began to walk. She put one foot in front of the other, a slow, agonizing battle against the elements. The ridge was a faint, dark line against the swirling gray sky, a goal that seemed impossibly far. Her body screamed in protest. Her skin burned with the cold, her lungs ached with every ragged breath, but she kept going. Fueled by nothing but pure, spiteful defiance. She would not die on their terms. Hours bled into an eternity of white. She lost all track of time, all sense of direction, guided only by the upward slope of the land. She finally reached the base of the ridge, her limbs numb and heavy as lead. The climb was even worse. The wind up here was a razor, slicing through her cloak, seeking her skin. She found it in a small crevice, sheltered by an overhang of rock near a waterfall frozen into a fantastic sculpture of ice. A small, miraculous patch of frost fern, its silver-green leaves dusted with snow. A wave of light-headed relief washed over her. She had done it. She fell to her knees, her frozen fingers fumbling as she carefully plucked the precious herbs and placed them in her sack. She had the medicine. She could go back. She could prove them all wrong. As she tied the sack shut, a deep, rumbling sound vibrated through the rock beneath her. It started as a low groan and escalated into a deafening crack. The world tilted violently. The overhang of rock and ice she was crouched under fractured, groaned, and gave way. She screamed as the ground disappeared from beneath her. She was falling, tumbling through a chaotic explosion of snow and ice. The sky and the earth swapped places. There was a moment of weightless terror, a horrifying certainty of the jagged rocks waiting below. This is it, she thought, a strange calm settling over the panic. This is the end. Then, something slammed into her. Not the unyielding impact of rock, but something else. A blur of dark fur and raw power moving through the blizzard with impossible speed. An arm, thick as a tree trunk and radiating a furnace-like heat, wrapped around her waist, yanking her out of the air. Her descent stopped with a jarring halt that knocked the wind from her lungs. She was dangling over the abyss, held securely against a chest as broad and solid as a mountain. Terrified, she twisted her head, looking up to see her savior. The man was huge, a giant clad in dark furs, his face harsh and predatorily beautiful. A fresh, deep gash bled sluggishly on his side, staining the snow-caked fur a dark crimson. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were not brown or blue or gray. They were the color of molten gold, and they were staring at her with an intensity that seemed to strip her soul bare. He held her. His bare hand was clamped around her upper arm, the heat of it a shocking, painful pleasure against her frozen skin. The moment his flesh touched hers, the world ended. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a silent detonation behind her eyes. A bolt of pure, white-hot energy shot up her arm from his point of contact, lancing through every nerve in her body. It was excruciating, a pain so absolute it transcended sound. She couldn't even scream. Her entire being was consumed by a fire that burned away the cold, the fear, the years of quiet misery, leaving only this singular, agonizing connection. A new pain, sharp and focused, erupted on the inside of her wrist. It felt as if a blacksmith's brand was being pressed into her skin. She dared to look down, her vision swimming. There, against her pale, frost-nipped flesh, a mark was appearing. It etched itself into her skin in lines of incandescent silver light, a complex, elegant symbol of a crescent moon cradling a single brilliant star. It glowed with a soft internal luminescence, pulsing in time with her frantic heartbeat. The giant holding her let out a sound that was not quite human, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through her entire body, a mix of pure shock, agonizing recognition, and something else. Something that sounded like a prayer answered after 1,000 years of silence. His molten gold eyes flared, the light within them intensifying until they looked like twin suns. With a surge of impossible strength, he hauled her the rest of the way onto the narrow ledge he occupied, pulling her flush against his massive frame. His grip was like iron, but there was a strange reverence to it now, as if he were holding something infinitely precious and fragile. He stared down at her, his gaze sweeping over her face, her tattered clothes, her shivering form, before coming to rest on the glowing mark on her wrist. "You," he breathed, and the single word was the sound of an avalanche in a deep canyon, vast and powerful and world-altering. His voice was raw, laced with a disbelief that bordered on worship. "You're her." Alara could only stare back, her mind a complete blank. Her body was a war zone of sensation. The searing brand on her wrist was fading to a warm, tingling thrum. The heat pouring off him was a dizzying blanket, chasing away the deadly chill. And beneath the terror, a strange, primal part of her she never knew existed was uncoiling. A deep-seated instinct that recognized this man, this stranger, and whispered a single, impossible word. Home. He lowered his head, his breath ghosting across her frozen cheek, smelling of pine and winter storms. His voice dropped to a possessive whisper that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her soul. Mine. The word shattered her paralysis. Terror, sharp and familiar, clawed its way back to the surface. This was a trap, a trick. Nothing this good, this warm could ever be for her. Abuse was her reality. Pain was her language. This overwhelming feeling of safety was a lie. She tried to pull away, to scramble back into the relative safety of the blizzard. "No," she gasped, the word a pathetic puff of white in the frigid air. He didn't let her go. He simply tightened his hold, not painfully, but with an absolute finality that said she wasn't going anywhere. He looked from her terrified face to the raging storm, then back again. His own face was tight with pain from the gash in his side. "We need shelter," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. He shifted his grip, sliding one powerful arm around her back and pulling her securely against his uninjured side. He was a walking furnace, a solid wall of muscle and heat that shielded her from the wind's claws. He guided her along the ledge towards a dark fissure in the rock she hadn't noticed before. It was a small cave, barely more than a hollow, but it was out of the wind. He eased her inside before following, his huge frame filling the entrance and plunging the small space into shadow. The storm howled outside, a distant, muffled beast. But in here, the only sounds were their ragged breaths and the frantic, terrified drumming of Alara's own heart. The intensity of his presence was suffocating, more overwhelming than the blizzard itself. He was so close, his heat a tangible pressure against her. The scent of him, pine, snow, and the faint metallic tang of blood filled her senses. What was happening? Who was this man? And what was this burning, glowing mark he had seared into her skin? The question swirled in her mind, a chaotic tempest of fear and utter world-shaking confusion. He watched her, his golden eyes glowing in the dim light, and she had the terrifying feeling that he could see every single one of them. In the days that followed, the Silver Moon Pack wrote Alara's obituary in their minds. The Omega was gone, swallowed by the White Death, a tragic but ultimately convenient loss. Lyra preened, enjoying the absence of the girl whose quiet resilience had always been a thorn in her side. Her father, Alpha Borin, felt a grim sense of relief. The pack's weakest link had been severed. They did not know that Alara was alive, huddled in a tiny cave with a man who felt more real than the world she had left behind. His name was Kalen. He spoke little, but his actions were a language she was slowly learning to understand. He had torn a strip from his own undershirt to better bandage the gash in his side, a wound he said he'd received from a shadow beast while hunting. He had given her the last of his rations, a strip of dried meat that tasted like heaven after her single piece of stale bread. He never touched her again after that first, cataclysmic contact, but his presence was a constant touch, a warmth that permeated the small cave and settled deep within her. The bond, the glowing mark on her wrist, was a silent hum between them, a current of awareness that flowed back and forth. She could feel the dull, throbbing pain of his injury as if it were her own, and she sensed, with a dizzying certainty, that he could feel the frantic, fearful fluttering of her heart. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was a pristine, sun-drenched expanse of white. The silence was profound. "I will take you back," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble. Fear, cold and familiar, pierced the fragile bubble of warmth she'd been living in. Back to Lyra. Back to the cold floors. Back to being nothing. "No," she whispered, the word instinctive. His golden eyes softened. "They will not harm you again. I will not allow it." She didn't understand his certainty, but she also knew she was too weak to argue. The journey had taken its toll. He was still injured, moving with a stiff, pained grace, but he insisted on carrying her when the snow was too deep. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his arms a cradle of strength. They were on the outskirts of the Silver Moon's territory, the familiar scent of their pack's wood smoke faint on the wind, when two figures crested a nearby hill. Alara's heart plummeted. It was Lyra, and beside her, Jorik, a hulking enforcer who followed Lyra like a loyal but dim-witted hound. Lyra's eyes widened when she saw them, first in shock, then in a flash of pure, venomous fury that Alara was alive. Jorik merely grunted, his hand going to the hilt of the large blade at his hip. He saw a stranger, a potential threat, carrying one of their pack. "Unhand her, rogue!" Jorik bellowed, striding forward with misplaced confidence. Kalen gently set Alara on her feet, placing himself between her and the approaching pair. He did not draw a weapon. He did not even tense. He simply stood there, an immovable mountain of silent power. But it was Lyra who saw it. As Kalen had set Alara down, her cloak had fallen away from her arm. The silver mark on her wrist, though no longer glowing brightly, was still clearly visible against her skin, a delicate, otherworldly tattoo. Lyra stopped dead. Her perfectly sculpted face went pale with disbelief. Her eyes, wide and greedy, were fixed on the mark. Alara had seen that look before. The day her father had brought home a perfectly matched set of hunting daggers. It was a look of covetous, all-consuming desire. Lyra recognized the symbol. Tales of the Alpha King and his fated mate, the one who would bear the moon and star brand, were legends whispered in every pack. Legends Lyra had always dreamed would be about her. The realization twisted her features into a mask of ugly jealousy. This worthless, filthy Omega was the fated queen? It was an obscenity, an injustice. But then, a sly, calculating cunning replaced the rage. She did not see a queen. She saw a tool, a pawn, a key to a level of power she could only have dreamed of. If she could control the king's mate, She could control the king himself. "Jorik," Lyra said, her voice suddenly silky and dangerous. "The poor dear has been through such an ordeal. This brute has clearly harmed her. Rescue her." Jorik needed no further encouragement. With a roar, he charged, drawing his blade. 2 other warriors who had been with them appeared from behind the snowdrift, their own weapons out. The fight was brutally short. Kalen moved with a predator's grace that belied his size and his injury. He disarmed Jorik with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, sending the larger man sprawling. He sidestepped the attack of another, using the man's own momentum to throw him into his companion. He was a force of nature. But the warriors were not fools. They had silver. The edge of a blade, laced with the precious, magic-dampening metal, sliced across Kalen's arm. He hissed in pain, a jolt of weakness running through him. The bond between them flickered, and Alara felt a wave of nausea. It was the opening Lyra had been waiting for. While Kalen was momentarily staggered, Lyra lunged for Alara. She was fast and strong, an alpha's daughter. She grabbed Alara by the hair, yanking her head back, and pressed the cold, sharp edge of a silver dagger to her throat. "Stop!" Lyra snarled at Kalen, her eyes glittering with triumph. "Or the little Omega dies. For real this time." Kalen froze. His golden eyes, blazing with fury only a moment before, were now fixed on the silver blade at Alara's throat. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest, a promise of retribution so terrible it made the air crackle. But he did not move. "Take her," Lyra commanded Jorik. Rough hands grabbed Alara. They dragged her away, her feet stumbling in the deep snow. She twisted her head, her eyes locking with Kalen's. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were a vortex of helpless rage and a silent, desperate promise. Then they dragged her over the hill, and he was gone. The world became a blur of pain and fear. They didn't take her to the longhouse. They dragged her to the dungeons, a place she had only heard of in terrified whispers, a place for rogues and traitors. They threw her into a small, windowless cell. The walls, the floor, the heavy iron door, everything was lined with silver. The moment the door slammed shut, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The warm, constant hum of the bond was violently choked off. It was like having a part of her soul ripped out. A cold, aching void opened up inside her, a desolation so profound it brought her to her knees. The silver burned her skin where she touched it, a cold fire that seemed to suck the very life from her. Physical pain she could handle. She had lived with it her entire life. But this was different. This was an agony of the spirit. She could feel Kalen, a faint, distant echo across a vast, static-filled chasm. She felt his panic, his incandescent fury, and his pain, all of it muted and distorted by the silver suffocating her. It was like listening to someone you love scream for you from the bottom of a deep, dark well. Hours or days passed. She lost track of time in the cold, silver darkness. She was alone with the echoing void, the despair of physical weight pressing down on her. They had given her a king only to snatch him away. They had shown her warmth only to plunge her back into an even colder hell. The heavy door creaked open. It was not Lyra who entered. This man was tall and slender, dressed in robes the color of ash. His face was unnaturally pale, his eyes dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. He moved with a chilling, serpentine grace, and the air around him felt thin and dead. "So," the man said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, "this is the great king's mate. How disappointing." He circled her cell, his dark eyes studying her as if she were an insect under glass. Lyra and her father stood behind him, their expressions a mixture of fear and avarice. "Lord Malachor," Alpha Boron said, his voice fawning. "She is as we promised." Malachor ignored him. He crouched down in front of Alara, his face uncomfortably close. "Kaelin has searched for you for centuries. A lost prophecy, a key to unlocking his full potential. He believes you are his strength. But I know the truth." He reached out a long, pale finger and traced the air just above the mark on her wrist. Alara flinched away. "You are not his strength," Malachor hissed, a cruel smile twisting his thin lips. "You are his weakness, and I will use you to shatter him. I will lure him here, to this place of silver and sorrow, and as he watches, helpless, I will perform a ritual of my own design. I will sever this pretty little bond of yours. I will take its power, the power of his fated connection, and make it my own. And you, little Omega, you will be the empty, worthless vessel you were always meant to be." His words were a physical poison, seeping into the cracks of her soul. Worthless. Vessel. The same words she had lived with her entire life, now given a new, horrifying dimension. The despair threatened to drown her. It was true. She was nothing, a curse upon the one person who had shown her kindness. They left her in the darkness, with his poison echoing in her ears. She curled into a ball on the cold, silver-laced floor, the ache in her soul a gaping wound. It was over. All of it. But as she lay there, broken and weeping, a flicker of something else stirred. The memory of Kaelin's eyes, the promise in them, the faint, nearly imperceptible thread of their bond, strained but not yet broken. She closed her eyes. She ignored the cold, the pain, the despair. She focused everything she was, every ounce of her will, on that tiny, distant ember. She reached for it, not with her hands, but with her spirit. She poured all her fear, all her hope, all her desperate need into that connection. Kaelin. And from across the void, a voice answered. It was not a sound in her ears, but a thunderclap in her mind, a wave of pure, concentrated power and unwavering promise that blasted through the silver's dampening effect. "Hold on, little moon." The voice was raw, primal, and filled with a love so fierce it was terrifying. "I am coming." Hope. It was no longer a dangerous luxury. It was a weapon. And for the first time in her life, Alara held it tight and refused to let go. The ritual began in a symphony of shadows. Lord Malachor drew crackling runes of dark energy on the floor around Alara, who was now chained to the center of the room with heavy, silver-forged manacles. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and old blood. Lyra and her father watched from the doorway, their faces pale with a mixture of excitement and fear. "The king's power will soon be mine," Malachor chanted, his voice rising. He raised a jagged obsidian dagger, its edge shimmering with malevolent energy. "And his kingdom will fall to the Ember Covenant. His bond will be my strength." He loomed over Alara, the knife held high, ready to strike down at the mark on her wrist. This was it. The end. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but to focus on the promise. I am coming. At that exact moment, the world exploded. The dungeon's outer wall didn't just break. It detonated inward in a cataclysmic shower of stone and splintered timber. Dust and snow swirled into the chamber, and standing in the breach, silhouetted against the blinding white light, was Kaelin. He was no longer the injured man from the cave. He was the Alpha King in his full, terrifying glory. His golden eyes were not just glowing, they were blazing infernos of apocalyptic rage. Flanking him were his royal guard, massive warriors in black and gold armor, their own eyes glowing with shared fury. A large-scale battle erupted instantly as the guard engaged Alpha-born's men, the clang of steel and roars of rage echoing through the dungeons. Malachor shrieked in fury, his concentration broken. "You are too late, King!" he screamed, turning his attention from the ritual back to Alara. "If I cannot have her power, then I will simply extinguish her light." He abandoned the ritual and lunged directly at Alara, his obsidian blade transformed into a whip of pure shadow aimed at her heart. Kaelin roared her name, fighting his way through the melee, but two of Boren's best warriors blocked his path. He would not reach her in time. Time seemed to slow down. Alara saw it all with perfect, horrifying clarity. The shadow weapon screaming towards her chest, Kaelin's desperate, furious face, Lyra's triumphant sneer. And something inside her finally, irrevocably, snapped. It was not a thought. It was a primal, instinctual certainty. He would not be harmed. She would not be a weakness. The years of pain, the humiliation, the cold, the hunger, the despair, and the new, ferocious, protective love she felt for her mate, it all coalesced into a single, incandescent point of pressure deep within her soul. And then it burst. A wave of pure silver light erupted from her body. It was not a fire. It was the light of the full moon given form, cool and cleansing and utterly absolute. It slammed into Malachor with the force of a tidal wave. His shadow whip dissolved into harmless smoke on contact. He was thrown backward, tumbling end over end, his body smoldering where the light had touched him. He shrieked, a high, thin sound of unimaginable pain as the pure, life-giving energy scoured his dark magic. The silver chains binding Alara's wrists and ankles did not just break, they melted, turning into harmless, shimmering puddles on the floor. The entire dungeon was flooded with her power, a soft, ethereal glow that pushed back the shadows and made the very stones seem to sing. She rose to her feet. She was no longer the trembling, hollowed-out girl from the attic. Her body felt light, thrumming with an energy she had never known, a power that felt as natural as breathing. Her eyes, when she opened them, glowed with a soft, lunar light. The battle around her had faltered, friend and foe alike staring in stunned silence. Kaelin had dispatched the warriors blocking him, and now stood frozen, his face a mask of utter awe. Alara's gaze, however, was fixed on the cowering form of Lord Malachor as he struggled to rise. She took a step towards him, her bare feet silent on the stone. "You called me worthless," she said, and her voice was not the timid whisper of an Omega. It was calm, clear, and resonant with a power that commanded the attention of every soul in the room. "You called me a vessel." She raised a hand. From the floor, vines of pure woven moonlight grew with impossible speed, wrapping around Malachor's limbs, his torso, pinning him to the ground. He struggled, but the light held him fast, sizzling against his dark aura. "I am no one's vessel," she declared, her voice rising, a proclamation to the world, to her mate, and most of all, to herself. "I am the moon to his sun, and your darkness ends now." She clenched her fist. The vines of light constricted. Malachor screamed as the lunar energy poured into him, not destroying him, but purifying him. It burned away his dark magic, his connection to the shadows, his ambition, leaving behind nothing but a powerless, whimpering man. In the stunned silence that followed, Lyra and her father, their faces ashen with terror and disbelief, were swiftly apprehended by Kaelin's royal guard. They didn't even try to fight. The world they knew had been turned upside down. The worthless Omega was a being of terrifying, celestial power. The battle was over. The silence in the dungeon was absolute, broken only by the sound of their breathing. The silver light emanating from Alara slowly softened, receding back into her until only her eyes held a faint, otherworldly glow. Kaelin moved then. He crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his large, calloused hands coming up to cup her face with a tenderness that made her want to weep. His thumbs gently stroked her cheeks, wiping away tears she hadn't even realized she'd shed. His golden eyes were soft, the raging inferno banked to a warm, gentle fire. They were filled with a reverence and a profound, soul-deep love that washed over her, healing all the broken places inside. "You saved me," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned into his touch, a shuddering breath escaping her lips. For the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly safe. She was not in his shadow. She was his equal. She was home. "You found me," she whispered back, her voice just as thick. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, resonant finality. It was a seal, a vow, a completion. The moment they touched, the world fell away, and there was only the 2 of them, a circuit of sun and moon, fire and light. The mark on her wrist flared with a brilliant, blinding silver radiance. A sharp, pleasant heat bloomed on the back of Kaelin's hand. He pulled back from the kiss, a soft gasp escaping his lips. They both looked down. There, burning itself into his skin in lines of molten gold, was a matching mark, a radiant sun, its rays encircling a single, brilliant star. The bond was no longer a one-way brand of fate. It was a bridge, built from both sides. He had been marked by her just as she had been by him. He had not just claimed her. She, in her moment of revelation, had claimed him right back. A slow, wondering smile touched Kaelin's lips. It was like watching the sunrise. It transformed his harsh, predatory features into something breathtakingly beautiful. He did not take her back to the Silver Moon territory. That place was a tomb of old pains, a memory she needed to leave behind. He took her home, to the Sunstone Citadel, a fortress city carved into the heart of a mountain, its halls warmed by geothermal heat and lit by massive sun-capturing crystals. He gathered his entire court, his pack, his people. Thousands of them filled the great Hall of the Sun, a chamber so vast it seemed to hold the sky itself. They were a sea of curious, powerful faces, all eyes fixed on the small, slender woman standing beside their ancient king. Kaelin stood with her on the high dais, his hand holding hers. He raised their joined hands for all to see, the golden sun on his skin and the silver moon on hers glowing in the crystal light. "For centuries I have ruled alone," his voice boomed, imbued with power, reaching every corner of the immense hall. "The pack has been strong, but it has been incomplete. The prophecies spoke of a mate, a queen of moonlight to balance my son, who would usher in an age of unrivaled peace and power." He paused, his gaze sweeping over his people before it came to rest, soft and adoring, on her. "I have found her," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute pride. He turned to her, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur meant only for her, though the entire hall hung on his every word. "They called you worthless. They tried to hide you in the shadows, to bury your light under shame and servitude. But they were fools." He reached out with his free hand, his touch gentle on her cheek. "I see you, Alara. I have always seen you, even before I found you. You are my mate, my heart, my strength." From a velvet cushion held by his most trusted beta, he took a simple, elegant circlet crafted from woven silver and set with a single, luminous moonstone that pulsed with a soft light, echoing the power within her. He gently placed it on her head. "You are my queen." For a heart-stopping moment, the hall was utterly silent. Then, a single warrior slammed his fist over his heart in a salute. Another followed, and then the entire hall erupted in a deafening roar of approval, a wave of sound and acceptance so powerful it shook the very foundations of the mountain. They were not just cheering for their king, they were cheering for her. Ilara looked out at the sea of faces, at the thousands of werewolves roaring her name, and she felt no fear, only a quiet, unshakable strength. She looked up at Kaelin, her king, her mate, and saw her past, her present, and a boundless, brilliant future all reflected in the molten gold of his eyes. She was no longer Alara the Omega, the invisible girl, the worthless servant. That girl had been burned away in the silver light of her own power. She was Alara, the moon queen of the Sunstone Pack. She was home. She was loved. She was whole.